was a really happy and enjoyable place to work, and I enjoyed it till my very last days here.
We were a very safe factory, really. Very safe factory. And it was a pleasure to work here.
I was very proud in some respects to have worked here and given me 38 years of a good living.
I noticed all along you got these banks, these earth banks, and were these structures around my grandfather around it? Are they pre-1940s, these structures?
Yeah, the majority of the factory is of 1940 vintage, some into 1941, mostly completed throughout 1940. The main exception being the heavy bomb unit, which was commenced and completed in 1942.
June 2013, nearly 70 years to the day since Glascoed produced its first munitions. The grandson of the man who built the factory pays his first ever visit to the site.
Okay, now I recognise some of these buildings here. Is this where this was taken? So do you want to pull over? We'll take a look, shall we? So whereabouts are we now, Glenn? This site it looks like it did back in 1938, 1940 with all this earthworks here at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that the site's returned to a similar perspective with the demolitions and clean-up that's going on here. But I think we've actually found the spot where your grandfather took this photograph all those years ago.
Patrick Davidson's grandfather, Major Cuthbert Davidson, was a civil engineer who had studied concrete fortifications in France during his military service in the First World War.
So I noticed on this, they see the profile of the hill, there's this feature, the gap in the trees. Is that the gap up there?
Yeah, that's the field has obviously been cleared through the trees before World War II and has remained to this day. I know the local farmer makes hay here quite regularly, but you can also see one of the original farms there just to the bottom right of that field, which is not in existence anymore, but it was quite prominent in those days.
By 1938, with war again fast approaching, he was sent, as a matter of urgency, to South Wales.
When he arrived down there, the site was basically farmland at the beginning, and he requested the Ministry of Defence for horses to be made available so he could do the survey on horseback to cover the terrain because it was so undulating and so rough.
I think everybody would agree it's in a perfect area because there's very, very few places you can see into it. It's totally secluded.
The nature of the terrain and the need to build quickly meant delays could not be tolerated.
This was basically a swamp out here. And because if you look at where the cartridge section used to be, it was all built up on stilts because it would be sinking. And lorries would get stuck in, they couldn't get them out, they didn't bother, they just buried them.
There was no shortage of manpower to build Glascoed and work in it.
At the time of selecting these factories, we were in the middle 1930s, the time of the Great Depression, so there was lots of unemployment about, and particularly quite close to here in the South Wales valleys, where the mines, many of them were closed. Lots of people are out of work. So we had the labour, we didn't have the expertise, but the powers to be resolved that by sending out specialists from Woolwich Arsenal to train the workforce and get the factory into production.
Tragically, Major Davidson became ill and died in the same month as production started.
His efforts weren't in vain, and of course that very aspect that the factory is still in production today, 60 years, 70 years on, is a wonderful testimony of his work.
June the 28th, 1940, the aftermath of a raid by a German bomber. A contractor was killed and several hurt. And this, remarkably, is the view from the German bomber during a second attack a few months later. The crew thought they were bombing a nearby aircraft factory. The Germans never came back. Glascoed's production and its secret remained intact. By 1943, 13,000 people, more women than men, were working at the factory.
Shell are filled in a series of operations including pallet loading, shell and former detection, filling, cooling by conveyor, former removal, cavity boring, cleaning and stenciling on a transfer machine linked by a powered conveyor system fitted with interlocking mechanisms.
We had things like a factory cobbler, with factory laundry, chauffeurs. There was a factory pest control officer, i.e. a rat catcher. And the canteens, of which there were 11 on site, even had their own baker, because we baked our own bread and made our own cakes as well.
1945 brought peace, celebrations and many changes at Glascoed.
Almost immediately the austerities ceased, the workforces were reduced. This workforce, I mean, it had gradually been reducing from 1943 from the peak of 13,000, but there were several thousand laid off within a few months. There was a large operation of ammunition breakdown disposal went on, but also what was called civil work was brought into nearly all the ordnance factories to supplement this. And Glascoed actually did various things. They made concrete railway sleepers, of which you still see many of them littered around the factory. They use them for steps, walls, all sorts of things, posts. But they also made concrete sectional houses called airy houses, named after the gentleman that invented them. Another job that was done was refurbishing of jerry cans, and they also made ceramic components for electrical installations as well. This was all through from a period of about 1946 to 1951, and then of course along came the Korean War, and there was a requirement for ammunition again.
Among the new recruits were former serviceman George Plowman and Ray Hook.
We were dressed like convicts, actually. We were dressed as, well, I think we had an arrow on there, like, you know, it was only one arrow, it wasn't a lot of arrows, but that one arrow, I think, was a War Office thing. I think it went back yonks, like, you know, that they used the arrow to define what was government property, but we were government property.
As a boy, George had accompanied his father delivering bricks for the construction of the admin building. His mother worked at Glascoed during the war. He spent 38 years here and looks back with pride.
We filled everything from medium caliber shell, 1,000-pound bombs, demolition charges, absolutely you name it, we filled it.
George and Ray worked alongside other former servicemen, including survivors of the Great War.
But those guys would come to work and fill their bombs and fill their shells and talk about rugby, talk about everyday life. But they'd been through horrors which we can't perceive now. We can't conceive that such horrors existed, you know, First World War.
With so many former members of the armed services, the regime was strict.
I remember as an apprentice getting told off for walking across the grass to the canteen, which nobody would perhaps bat an eyelid at these days.
We had a London foreman who came from Woolwich Arsenal, and when he walked to a filling shop, every eye in the shop would be sort of half on him and half on the job. And if there was a spot of explosive on the floor, he wouldn't look around and call anyone, he'd just stand still and point to it. And someone would rush up with a little brush and what have you. And that was all he needed to do.
Glenn Chappell began his 44-year career at Glascoed in 1965.
I applied here to be an apprentice carpenter. To get an apprenticeship in the ROF, as it was called then, was a bit of a jewel in the crown. There were apprenticeships in other local factories, but everybody wanted to go for the ROF one because it was recognised as a very good apprenticeship. There was a good training scheme here.
In the 1970s, the pay available in other local industries tempted people to leave Glascoed, but the grass was not always greener.
The mining industry improved in about the 1970s, the mine, and you did have a lot of people leave here for the mines and what have you. One guy I remember, Reg Baker, Reg played for Pontypool and he was a senior overlooker on Group 1, and Reg left to go back to the mines, and within about 9 months he was killed in a fall in the mines. It was quite sad, really. But yes, they did go back to the mines, quite a few of them, because the money was never great in Glascoed. but it was regular.
For loyal employees like George Plowman, changes through the 1970s and 1980s, leading up to privatisation in 1987, brought uncertainty.
We suddenly were presented with a great team of computer experts. And it was quite interesting, really, because nobody believed it, that it could be done. You could find out how many shell we had, how many we'd filled the day before, how many components we had, what was holding us up here, and were the companies that we were dealing with holding us up. And then they could suddenly started to see that it didn't hinder their job, it made it that much better and easier.
Together, George, Ray and Glenn worked at Glascoed for around 116 years. But soon after starting, Ray had been warned his career would be short-lived.
As I came through the danger gates, a guy picked me up and took me for my magazine suit. And he said, "I don't know why they've started you," he said. He said, "There's going to be redundancy soon, this place is going to shut." And when I learned that the future for Glascoed is looking up, when I see the new admin building, I'm very, very reassured that Glascoed has got a future.
That future has been made possible by a long-term agreement with the Ministry of Defence worth £2 billion across the whole munitions business. £50 million is being spent in Glascoed, overseen by a man who spent his childhood living in the shadow of the factory.
I grew up in the area. I went to the local Glascoed Junior School, all 28 of us when I started. So I've had a long association with people that work at the site, always been aware of it sitting there in the background, but until I actually started working here 5 years ago, I really knew very little. I came in as part of the transformation team with a remit to drive through significant change on the site. And I think we've gone through that and will continue to go through periods of change now, I think, for the next few years. We're just responding to the market and what the market requires. I think, you know, we need to ensure that we do the right things and take the hard, difficult decisions now to make sure that we've got a business model that will work going on into the future. And I think that's what we're about.
But as the business moves forward, its history, experience and knowledge remain key factors in Glascoed's future.
But we must never lose the linkage with the past. I think that heritage is really important to us, and there are lots of lessons that we can still learn from the past, and we mustn't just forget about it all. So I think, you know, the Heritage Centre and constantly looking back for what worked well and what we can still use going forward is an important part of it.
And the people who helped set those high standards look back with affection at their working lives at Glascoed.
It was a great place to work, and the happy times that I've remembered in Glascoed, there was a lot of laughter in Glascoed.
I left and it was a big vacuum, obviously. I'd been here so long.
To walk on the ground where he stood, it's been a real privilege, and because it always has been a missing part of my history, not knowing my grandfather, but to go back and walk in his footsteps has been a great opportunity.